Hi, welcome to Don't Get Rusty, where we have fun chatting about things that will help keep you proficient. I'm Keith West, and today our webinar Is Your Airplane Rusty Too? Our guest is Norm Eisler, AOPA Ambassador to the Northeast and aircraft owner. Our panel will be talking to Norm about the steps that you can take if you're flying an aircraft that you haven't flown in a while. We're going to jump right into introductions, but if you'll give me 60 seconds, I'll go over how the webinar will work and how you can interact with our panelists. One other thing, this webinar is being recorded. It will appear on the AOPA YouTube channel in about 24 hours. Also, this webinar is eligible for Wings credit. You don't have to do anything. It will automatically appear in your account sometime next week. All right, let's get started. If you are on a computer, you're going to see a display that looks something like this. You should be muted, which means that we will be the only ones talking on the webinar today. If you want to get the attention of our producer, whose name is Steven, say hi.
Hello.
You'll raise your hand and Steven will respond to you. If you want to ask a question, there's the questions tab. So you click that and type in a question, and we will be getting to as many questions as we possibly can today. If the question fits in right as we're going through the webinar, we'll do it then, or at the last, at least 15, 20 minutes of the webinar, be pure question and answer. And if there is a message from you, from one of our producers, you will see the chat message right there light up. And there are a couple of handouts on this webinar. We will have the resources that Norm will mention will be in there. And we've also left last week's handout in there too. And it was about, if you will recall, the steps to take if you haven't flown for a while, how you can get yourself proficient. Okay, and if you need, for any reason, I don't know why you would, but to go to webinar support, it's there. And if you want to exit the webinar, it's at the bottom. So if you are on a device such as an iPad or iPhone, you should have a display that looks something like this. That would be your microphone. You can raise your hand with the icon right there. You are also able to ask questions, and then you can toggle between screens. We have a couple of polls in today's webinar. If you're on an iPad, you'll kind of lock up, so swipe left and you will be able to get back to the webinar. All right, let's jump into it. As I said, my name is Keith West. I'm a flight instructor, and my position at AOPA is to help flight schools to deliver a better flight training experience. I am joined by Chris Mosier. Chris, are you there?
Hey, Keith. Chris Moser, and I'm the Senior Director for Flight Training Education at AOPA, and I work with schools and CFIs and mainly work on developing educational resources for the app that Pablo is in charge of getting developed. Go, Pablo.
Hello. Thanks, Chris. So I'm a technology guy that works with the aforementioned items that Keith said about helping schools, and this is also helping students. So I'm working on some technology for instructors to be grading in a cockpit and to help training move along better and faster. And with us today, our esteemed Mr. Ambassador, Norm Eisler, as I'd like to say, like in Scotch. Norm, welcome.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks for having me. I am Norm Eisler. I'm the Northeast Regional Ambassador for AOPA's You Can Fly program. An ambassador, basically, I'm involved with dealing with the public. I work a great deal with flying clubs, and if you're forming a flying club, have a flying club, want to form a flying club, or have questions about forming a flying club, love to chat with you. You'll see my contact information at the end of the presentation. I also work a lot with Rusty pilots doing those seminars, and we are now doing those as live webinars until we can get back out in the public. I also work with high schools and flight schools across my area, which is basically New York, Pennsylvania, a little bit of Ohio, and New Jersey. But feel free to give a call if you have a chance to chat about any of that or some of the things we're going to talk about today. Great to be here.
Well, thank you. And we are going to, like we always like to do, we are going to start with a poll to get some interaction going. Steven, let's roll the poll. And I am going to turn over the presenter to Norm here, and he will take over that part of it.
Do you own an airplane? Got some good choices there, you guys.
Yeah, look at that. Okay. Let's see.
There's a lot of different ways to have an aircraft available, and owning is just one of them.
Right.
Oh,
So
guys,
what?
look at the results coming in. Lots of people owners.
Excellent.
Look at that. Wow. You know,
Wow.
because, well, we wondered about having a webinar that was focused on pure ownership if we would have enough interest or people out there, but it looks like we are really doing well with that. Wow.
And if you combine the flying club, you know,
Yeah.
they're
Really,
part owners well for some of these. So
That's
Yeah,
right.
Oh,
a
well,
lot of
all right,
folks.
dudes, we found an audience.
yeah, that's a good one.
Now we just have to find a presentation for them.
That's right. Okay, Stephen, it looks like the numbers have pretty much stabilized. Go ahead and let's show the audience the results of our poll.
That's
Big
incredible.
number. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, it
48%
really is.
owners. That's great.
And like a quarter though also renting as well though. I like the
Well,
folks though with the full paper airplane. I'm good at those.
But look at this one though. I don't currently own, but would like to, and plan to. So 12%. That's pretty good. It's over 60, almost 70%.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So there are a lot of aircraft owners, it would appear.
Excellent.
All right, Norm.
Keith,
Oh,
I'm not seeing that box to transfer the presentation over to me.
Oh, okay. Well, here, let's try that again. All right.
Okay.
So, you know, it's not giving me the option because you do have the presentation. Go ahead and click to the next slide and see if it changes.
Okay.
You're not sharing. You're not sharing your screen, Norm.
Yeah, you're not sharing your screen.
We just love technology. There we go.
Notice we are not the aircraft technology owners of
That's
our
right.
There we go.
association, right?
There we go.
All right. There we go. Now we got it. Well, today we're going to put the O back in Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association because absolutely we are the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. So we want to make sure we get that in there. We have a lot of material.
How did you sneak that in there, Norm? I thought we nixed that. We don't do animations on it. We're not about PowerPoint.
Well, I wanted to do something to keep the three of you entertained early on in the program.
Well, it's good to keep us interested. Yeah, exactly. Okay. All right. Continue.
All right. Thank you. So today's conversation, we're going to talk a little bit about the advantages of owning versus renting. Each one has some advantages. What happens between putting your airplane away in the fall and taking it out in the spring is a big one. And Keith made the comment earlier that, you know, if you haven't flown in a while, it may not be your first flight of the spring, but there might be a reason that you haven't flown for a while. You still want to go through kind of the same steps, preparing for that first flight of the season or first flight in a long time. And we're also going to touch on owner maintenance, what you're allowed to do and what maybe you shouldn't be doing on your own. Just as a little bit of background, I've owned 2 aircraft over the past 10 years or so, and have a fair amount of experience working with A&Ps and doing some of the work myself.
What are you on now, Norm?
The aircraft I own right now, you're going to see some pictures of it a little bit later on. It is a 1958 Cessna 175, which is pretty much the same as a 172, but it has a different motor in it and a different panel in it. Before that, I owned a 1977 Beach Sport, which was a wonderful airplane. I owned that for about 9 years. I'll touch on why I don't own it anymore later on. And I am also very, very fortunate that I have a company car provided by AOPA. I have one of the bright yellow Cessna 152s reimagined. So basically, I have a brand new 1985 Cessna 152 to fly.
Awesome.
So let's talk a little bit about advantages of renting, and I'm sure you'll all recognize these. Number one, somebody else is responsible for the paperwork, so that keeps life a little bit simpler on each of us. The airplanes that you rent, they're always perfectly clean inside and out. They always look like they're practically brand new, right?
Wait a minute. Where do you rent? Because I want to go to this FBO.
Well, there might be just a little bit of sarcasm in some of these bullet points, Keith.
All right.
Because after all, they always have that new airplane smell, right? We're experienced with finding that every time. And they're, of course, always perfectly maintained. Now, we're poking fun at rental airplanes, but the fact is there are some wonderful FBOs and flight schools out there where you can rent airplanes. I don't want to give the impression that it's always a negative experience. A lot of times it's very good. The renting an airplane, depending on how much you fly, might be a really good option. Unless you get paid to fly, there's basically two ways you get an airplane. You either rent them or you own them. These are some of the advantages of renting, and probably the biggest advantage, if you're not flying a lot of hours, you're only paying for the hours that you're actually using the aircraft. So it's probably a smaller investment than if you're going to be buying the aircraft. Let's take a look at a couple of options or advantages of owning an aircraft and also being a club member. As I recall, we had about 50% of our attendees today are owners and about 25% are members of a club. A lot of the same advantages apply here. You always keep the aircraft pretty much like it is brand new. There's that pride of ownership. And so owners or partial owners have a tendency to really treat the airplane like it's their own, like they want it to. You have control of the paperwork and you know it's right. Anytime you're renting an aircraft, you have to inquire about the status of the logbooks and all the paperwork that goes along with it. When you own the aircraft, you have the option of maintaining the paperwork yourself, and you know it's right. In fact, what I do is I have a status sheet for my airplane, and it shows exactly when every function is required, when it's next due for an ELT battery, when the annual's due, when the oil's due, and so on. So I always know where I'm at with it. You and your partners or co-owners always keep it perfectly clean inside and out. Again, there's that pride of ownership. I've had other people use my aircraft. In fact, the first aircraft I owned, I co-owned, partnered with my son. And there was always this competition to try and put the airplane away more perfectly on the center line, leave the cabin cleaner. That's the kind of person you want as a partner to share your airplane with. Basically, you do tend to keep them perfectly maintained, make sure everything is up to date and done as it's supposed to be. And if you want, you can buy a little can of spray and you can always have that new airplane smell. But every time that the airplane is used, it tends to be by an owner, so there's that pride of ownership. Also, there's a very high value of ownership. Basically, airplanes today tend to increase in value over time, at least many of them are. So there's a very good chance the money you invest, you'll be able to get back out in total.
So you're
when
saying it's an
ready to.
investment, right?
An airplane can be an investment. I'm not gonna, guys, don't quote me when you go and talk to your family members and
No,
say,
do quote him because as an
the
ex-sales
guy
guy,
on
I was like,
AOPA
it's not a
told. Right.
cost, it's the investment.
That's right. If you're going to do a significant amount of flying, and when my son and I bought the first airplane, we really did look into the numbers a bit, and we realized that if we looked at 2 years for both of us to get our tickets, and we were both going to do a fair amount of flying, we could actually own an aircraft for the same amount of money that we would pay to rent the airplane over the course of that next 2 years or so, and then we'd have something that we could sell at the end of the 2 years if we wanted to. So I'm not telling you you're going to make a fortune on an airplane, but if you're going to fly a good deal, you may very well find out that it's a good investment to cover the cost of flying.
No, in all seriousness, I looked at a VREF book recently, and after the first maybe 5 years or so of an aircraft, from new, they do hold their value and then start going up. It's remarkable. I don't know of any other piece of equipment that holds its value to such an extent.
And I know
Absolutely.
I've heard from a number of members too that the shows and things like that talking about how they would buy an airplane to learn in and then do all their learning and then go to sell it at the end. They basically broke even, so they didn't effectively have to pay for any of that rent. So that's certainly if you can handle that, that's a good deal. I know that, by the way, the market is hot right now too, right? People buying airplanes like crazy. So
well, the big problem, AOPA finance, the big problem they're having is people are getting approved for loans, but they're not able to find an aircraft to buy to to actually close on the loan. So it's a remarkably tight, surprisingly tight market out there.
Yeah.
Certain models, certain brand names are extremely hot. One of the things that, and we could go on about buying an airplane, which is not the subject of today's event, but we could go on for quite a while. Certain brands, certain models are extremely hot, and the prices are way up there. Sometimes just looking at a different brand or a different model airplane can give you similar performance at a much different cost and get you
Yeah.
every bit as much performance and every bit as much quality as you might have
Yeah, I've really
before.
been weighing the difference between a Spitfire and a P-51. I think I'm having a hard time with that. So
I saw a Corsair for sale, 3.5 million this week. So
that's hot.
You know, I don't know. I found this little pedal plane that I think would be just right. It's a little bit tight in the cockpit for me, though.
All right.
All right, moving forward
Hey
here.
Norm, real quick. So there's
Yeah.
someone that says, how about helicopters? Do you think any of this pertains to helicopters as well?
As
The
far
pros and
as
cons?
the costs and the values and so on.
Yeah, the pros and cons of owning an airplane. Does that also refer to a helicopter?
Yeah. Well, I'm
I
sorry.
have
Go
to
ahead,
tell
Norm.
you, I consider myself an expert on helicopters because I have almost 1.7 hours of flight experience in a helicopter. Um, I I would have to think that some of the numbers transfer over. Uh, the reason I say that is, of course, maintenance and so on a helicopter is significantly higher than it is on fixed wing aircraft. But then again, the rental costs of a helicopter are also extremely high on an hourly basis. So you'd have to look at the numbers and really try and make some sense out of them. But I would think that to some degree, there's probably some match up there. But
I
you'd
think
have
so.
to
I mean,
use the asset a lot.
it's just math. I mean, so you're weighing out the cost per hour over the cost of ownership and comparing the two.
Exactly.
All right.
Well, let's move on here and talk a little bit about coming out of winter hibernation. This year, a lot of us had a few extra months thrown into hibernation. Now, in some parts of the country, a lot of people have been doing flying. I live in upstate New York, and I think this week the snowstorms are going to start or stop. We've really had kind of a long winter, not a lot of snow, but cold and wet, and it just dragged on all the way through May. So good flying weather has really only just started in the last few weeks. I can't tell you how many times I was thinking about going out flying, and by the day that I had time available got here, the weather was just no good. So between that and the virus situation, a lot of us have added some extra time into our winter hibernation. But now, after months of sitting at home, we're finally ready to go out. We're ready to get into that airplane, and the airplane's been sitting patiently waiting for us. And we go out to the airport. What could possibly go wrong with this idea? And we all put our airplane away. By the way, you asked what I own right now. This is 9416 Bravo. This is that 1958 Cessna 175. I'm proud to say my airplane is old enough to collect Social Security, although it's not yet. I bought this airplane kind of as a project, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But you put your baby away at the end of the flight season, and it's in this nice clean environment. The airplane, you've just cleaned it out, and the oil change is fresh, and everything's ready to go, and we put it away. And then come spring, 6 months later, what happened?
Whoa. Which hangar is yours? Is it the nice clean concrete or is it the gravel floor?
Well, to be honest with you, this particular picture was taken where I went to look at the airplane before I purchased it.
So you have the concrete floor with that lawnmower.
That's
Why is your lawnmower in your hangar? I'm just curious.
Well, okay, you're going to
No,
make
I
me
didn't
go
believe
back. If you take a look at that picture, you'll notice there is no motor deck on my Tug.
So that's
This
how you
is,
don't want to walk to the FBO. You jump on your lawnmower and take a ride.
that's correct.
Okay.
But more importantly, there is a bit
By
of
the
an
way,
uphill ramp
it
to
looks like
put
you
the
had a bird
airplane
strike
back
there
into
too.
the hangar. And if I'm there by myself, sometimes I will use the Tug to move the airplane around. When there's two of us, we'll usually just do it by brute force. But talk about saving money. This particular garden tractor without a motor deck was a gift to me from my wife and my son, and it is a very cost-effective way to move an airplane when you need to. I'm not a believer in starting an engine for a 3-minute, 5-minute run, and so if I need to take it over to the mechanic for an oil change at the other side of the airport, I'll tow it down there. instead. It works
But
very
you know what?
effectively.
You don't have a couch and place to hang out and like, you know, some metal signs on the walls. I'm sure that's coming, right?
Well, actually, a different view would give you a different impression of the hangar. We'll just
Okay.
leave it at that for now.
All right. Got it. All right. Continue. Sorry.
This picture was when I first visited the airplane, when I first saw it, and the previous owner had put it away in the hangar the previous fall. This particular hangar, if you look, you'll notice that beneath the sidewalls, there's lots of room for critters to get in there and birds that nested in the rafters up over the airplane. And so obviously the airplane was not as clean as it was when it was put away. So that can happen. And over the course of the winter, in fact, the hangar next to mine where I'm based right now, I have never seen a bird in my hangar, but my hangar neighbor does have a problem with birds getting in and building nests up over his airplane. So it's all a matter of the luck of the draw of the door sealing properly, I guess. So this is what can happen after just a few months sitting in a hangar, because I know the previous owner did put it away clean. And then you can have something really horrifying happen. Hangar rash. This is actually the airplane that I owned for 9 years. In this case, I did get a phone call about it, but if you take a look in there, you'll see I got a phone call that there'd been an accident at the airport. Someone had lost control of an airplane that he was taxiing. Keep in mind that my airplane was locked in the hangar with the doors closed, the lights off, and the battery charger plugged in. The aircraft lost control and went right through the back wall of my hangar. And initially we thought that, well, needs a rudder and an elevator. And then we noticed that the entire tail cone was crunched. Now, this is kind of a worst case scenario. And of course, I did get notification from the airport. But my point here is hangar rash happens in hangars, especially where you share the space with others. So when you first get out there to see the airplane, you want to make sure you do a really thorough, careful investigation to see the condition of the airplane. Hopefully none of you ever go through that experience. So we've got a balancing point here that we all try and hit. We want to make sure the airplane is maintained properly. We want to keep it in the best possible condition. How can we improve aircraft maintenance and at the same time keep our costs in line? As an aircraft owner, we've got options and we have to ask ourselves some questions. And here's our second poll, by the way. I don't know how many of you have had this happen to you. I have to admit, it happened to me once. I got to the airport. I was going to an appointment, about a 45-minute flight away. Got to the airport, walked out to the airplane, and I had a flat nose wheel.
Let's roll that
So
poll.
let's ask.
There we go. Sorry.
There we go, rolling the poll. As a private pilot, we all know that aircraft maintenance is a very carefully controlled thing. As a private pilot, can you fix this? And we'll go with a simple yes or no answer on this poll. It's something that all of us could face, and a repair of a tire is something that might affect us in terms of the cost of maintaining the airplane.
Do you mean am I able to, or is it legally permissible?
Well, for the initial question, can you legally fix this is the question.
All right.
And,
so someone's asking, Norm, I'd like to become an A&P so I can work on my airplane. How practical is that? How long will it take working on my airplane under the supervision of my IA A&P?
Is it possible to do so? Yes. And I have some friends that are working on that.
Well, they actually asked, is it practical?
Well, you know, what is practical?
I know. Well, I mean, money, time, right? And for the things that I might do.
If you've got the time and it's something you want to do, sure. I mean, I know a number of people who have done that, you know, and it could be a good idea if you're interested in that sort of thing. If you think you're going to save money doing that, I don't know that it's that good of an idea. What do you think, Norm?
I agree with you. It's a big investment, and I don't mean dollars. I mean time and effort. Becoming an A&P is a very involved thing. They don't create an A&P or they don't create a mechanic that is simply skilled in repairing tires. They don't create a mechanic that simply works on engines. The certification is to do repairs on all systems, on all aircrafts, believe it or not. So if you have your A&P, You can legally work on jets, you can legally work on pistons. Most mechanics will specialize. They won't work across the board, but you have to have a lot of knowledge, a lot of practical experience before you can test through
Correct.
and try and get it.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have to be an IA to sign off your annual. So I don't think even if you're an A&P, you can't sign off your annual. Is that right?
That's
That
correct.
is
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
The exception to that is if it's a home built and you build it, then you
Right.
can do your own condition inspections.
All
But
right, Stephen, let's roll those results.
okay,
Okay, so what do
three
you think,
quarters.
Norm?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming. 3/4 of you say yes, you can, and the answer is you are correct. Legally, yes, you can fix that tire if you are a pilot or an operator of that aircraft. The key question here is, should you fix it? And by the way, let me just step back here a bit. There is a specific list of things that we're allowed to do as licensed pilots working on the aircraft. The FARs are very clear. They have Part 43, Appendix A, subsection C, that lists out the specific functions that we're allowed to do. The FAA has an excellent publication called Maintenance Aspects of Owning Your Own Aircraft, and I highly recommend if you own an airplane that you have a look through this. Don't worry about scribbling the name down, because if you download the reference sheet that we've got here, it'll have the link to go to this. It's only about a 10-page, 12-page document, and the nice thing is it's written in plain language, not legalese, so that it's easy to read through it and understand. Basically, what the FARs tell us is that we can do what the FAA defines as preventive maintenance. So we can repair or replace tires. We can deal with shock absorbers on landing gears. We can replace bulbs, wheel bearings. We can do some simple fabric patches. If you've got a fabric covered airplane, you can deal with almost all the fluids. You can even get into the upholstery, and I mentioned that the Cessna 175 that I bought as a project aircraft, I have replaced the entire interior of that aircraft, which is completely legal to do. The important thing to keep in mind here is anything that you do, you need to make sure you know how to do it correctly. I work with the A&Ps. I'm a big believer, when possible, doing, for example, owner-assisted annual. And I've worked with the mechanics at the shop that I'm with for several years now, and they know that I know what my limitations are. So the first time I do something, for example, the first time I pulled the spark plugs, cleaned them, and reinstalled them, they worked with me at doing the first one or two, made sure I knew what I was doing, and then turned me loose to do it for the rest of the plugs. Now they just say, Norm, change the, pull the plugs, clean them up, rotate them, and put them back in, because they know I can do it. Whenever you do this, it needs to be done in accordance with industry standards. Your mechanic can help you out on it.
Norm, sorry to interrupt. Just real quick, just something you said about we were talking about 2 minutes ago about the whole becoming an IA or A&P. So somebody said that it's actually 30 months start to finish if you just did it straight. So thank you for that, Clayton. Secondly, someone asked, because you talked about an experimental, can a certified aircraft be converted to experimental? If yes, would the maintenance rules for experimentals still apply?
The short answer is not likely. There are certain instances where, for demonstration purposes, a certified aircraft might be moved into the experimental category. For example, if you're experimenting with putting a diesel engine onto a certified aircraft, it's no longer going to be able to fly under its original certificate. So it's going to become a demonstration. I think it's called experimental. But no, you can't own a Cessna 172, say, I'm now going to call this an experimental and now I can work on it.
Well, and if we remember too, being able to sign off your aircraft and do your work on it as an experimental home built, you built it. I mean, if you get a home built that somebody else built, I mean, you still got, I think, most of the rules in place.
Yes, I believe it's you have to
Absolutely.
build 51% or more and you get your repairman certificate, which allows all that. So that wouldn't count just by changing the certification. Hey, we do have one question here that I saw earlier on that popped up and it
Okay.
really is applicable. So we've got Pierre asking, as an owner, am I allowed to make an adjustment on my steam gauge altimeter? It looks very simple and it involves loosening a side screw and adjusting the needle to the right altitude. The altimeter shows 40 to 50 feet below the actual altitude. Thanks. And I guess it's must be one without the Colesman window or something, I'm guessing, because otherwise you'd be able to adjust it on your own. So what do you guys think about that? I know I was looking at part 43. I didn't see anything there about adjusting flight instruments. So what do you guys think?
Go ahead, Noah.
Well, my initial response is probably not. At least the only way I would say you might be able to do that is under the supervision of an A&P. I have to admit, I've never run into that one, but I would not feel comfortable doing it. Remember that anytime you do any of this, if you change the tire, you change the oil, you put a new light bulb in, you're still expected as the pilot to make a logbook entry. And making a logbook entry that I changed the oil, I changed the filter safety in accordance with the standard procedures, op checked the engine for no leaks, and signed it off as Norm Eisler private pilot certificate number, and you are expected to list all that in there. It's part of the logbook entry. But I don't believe that you can basically recondition a flight instrument.
So somebody is saying, and we don't know the validity of it, but saying that is in part 65, only a CRS rated for that instrument can work on it. So
There we go.
Yeah.
I'd be
I love
inclined to believe
these
that.
answers.
Yeah, the wisdom of crowds, right?
Exactly.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And by the way, for all of you that that are attending this free seminar, I remind you that free advice is worth every penny you paid for it. But my point, though, is there's a tremendous amount that you can do completely legally, but it has to be based on the fact that you actually know what you're doing. There's a lot of things that I have done that I've asked my mechanic. He says, "Sure, go ahead." And when you have questions, come over and talk to me. And periodically, he'll just come over, look over my shoulder, and make sure I'm doing what he wants it to do, and he'll give advice and whatever. And that's probably the best way to learn. I've also done a tremendous amount of reading and so on. So I've gained a lot of that experience. But when in doubt, go to someone that knows what they're doing.
And I imagine in those cases, Norm, too, you're probably having, if it's something that's not on the preventive maintenance or whatever, that you might get that relationship you've built, then the A&P is the one signing off on the repair, just sort of letting you help with it. Yeah.
The older Cessnas, most of the Cessnas, have an issue, for example, with the seat lock mechanism, that some of them have been known to release in flight, and suddenly the operator of the aircraft find themselves pretty much in the back seat. For the record, this is bad. And so Cessna has a refit kit that installs a secondary seat lock. It is required to be signed off by a mechanic. But in my case, literally the mechanic said, "Okay, bring the airplane over, bring the seat in," gave me a table in the middle of the shop area and said, "Have at it." There's a 2-inch binder of Cessna instructions that covers how to do it, and working with the instructions and with the mechanics periodically stopping over and looking, saying, "That looks good," or "How about if you do this?" The mechanic did do the sign off at the end, but I did 99% of the work.
Cool.
So.
All right.
Hey, Norm.
Yeah.
As an owner, is an owner allowed to use assistance from a non-owner? For example, if you're changing the interior upholstery and your son, wife, or friend help out?
I think the more important thing is what you're working on than who might be helping you. I will confess that my wife is a great help to me on many of the projects that I do. And while not a pilot, she loves being around the airplane. I'm very fortunate that my wife not only tolerates, but actually actively supports my obsession with airplanes. And that sets me as a very lucky guy compared to a lot of others. But I think the important thing is someone who has a pilot certificate, just as someone who is a mechanic, certified mechanic, is the person doing the sign off. Who's helping you do it? It's just like I'm helping the mechanic, but he's doing the sign off. I don't think there's a problem. The important thing is that you're doing things you're allowed to do, and you're doing them in a proper workmanlike fashion to the standards of the industry. That cover it, Pablo?
Yeah, I think so. We had one though, again related to I think this, and that's why I'll ask it though. Is it's kind of funny how it starts. I've heard airplanes like to fly and not sit in a hangar. What is the max time a piston engine airplane can sit without flying?
Ooh.
You're on the hot seat now.
I don't know that there is an answer to that one. Maybe the answer is until someone can afford to put some gas in it and try it out. I have known airplanes, you always read about these barn find airplanes, that someone found this beautiful airplane sitting in a barn. It hasn't been run in 20 years. They got the dust off it, they cranked the engine, and by golly, it started, and they flew it. I would have a lot of concerns about an engine that sat for 4 years. The airplane that I bought actually for a period of time did not fly for 4 years. And again, what's done, first off, let's talk about what's the environment. Is it in Florida by the seacoast where you have a lot of humidity and a lot of salt in the air? Or is it somewhere in heartland of America with low humidity and better environment? And was the engine pickled? Was the aircraft preserved in any way, shape, or fashion? So I don't know that there's a time factor, but I would certainly say any airplane that sat for any length of time, even if it's just over the winter, you need to do a really, really thorough investigation to get ready before you fly it. Okay?
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right.
I'm going to come back to this flat tire for just a minute. We've sort of touched on the question, but the next question is, should you fix it? And that's a very personal question. I've been an adamant do-it-yourselfer for many years. I've worked on my own home, worked on my own cars, and I do things on my own airplane. I spent 20 years in the home improvement industry, and a lot of that time was in a home center giving people advice on how to do things, including plumbing and electric. And I could talk a person through how to add a new circuit, work in the circuit breaker box, and all of that sort of thing. And if they said, I'm really not comfortable taking the cover off the circuit breaker box, my answer was, I think you should call an electrician. Same here. If you know how to repair a tire, if you know how to use the tools, if you have the proper tools available, then sure, go ahead and do it. If you're not comfortable with the idea of doing it, then it might be time to call a certified mechanic and let somebody else do it. You guys have any thoughts on that?
There have been a couple of questions about, do you have to own an aircraft to be able to perform these repairs? And I've been looking it up. So the actual regulation says, except blah, 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 not use this chapter, the holder of a sport, anyway, owned or operated is what it says. And so then
that's the key word. I did some research into that because someone challenged me on that you have to be the owner. And it may have been worded that way at one time, but today the wording in the FARs are owner or operator. But you do have to have a certificate in order to do it. So if you're not a licensed mechanic, you've got to be a pilot. You can't just have your car mechanic do it for you.
So real quick, guys, just a few minutes ago, we talked about going from certified to experimental. And somebody did help us out with this, I think. And Robert has told us that on the EAA forum, there's a link to that exact topic of converting certified to experimental. I've added that to the chat if anyone wants to see that.
Very cool.
Excellent. Thank you once again for some input.
Oh yeah, the crowd, man, today they're on fire.
They're on it.
Absolutely. Well, that's what happens when you get the O back into AOPA. We got the owners out there, and they're all participating.
That's right. That's right.
And I one of the things that is great about owning an airplane, and I mentioned earlier, I like to do owner-assisted annuals. I could pay the guy to do the annual. The fact of the matter is, there's no 10% discount for helping. In fact, I think some mechanics and some owners, the mechanics probably want to charge extra to have the owner help because they ask questions and they get in the way of the mechanic what they're used to doing. But the amount of information I've learned about my aircraft and what I should know about it and how to maintain it, and just the comments that sometimes they might make in helping me along, it's phenomenal information. And so you get to know a lot more about your airplane when you do this stuff yourself. So let's talk about it. We're going to the beginning of the season here and we're ready to start flying. Keith, I'm going to upset you here because I know that we don't do PowerPoint, but I've just got to point out one of the dangers of getting into that first flight. You get into the hangar, and as we said, you know, some of the hangars, they're not exactly critter proof. We find ourselves with snakes on our airplane. If you remember that cinematic classic, you're probably dating yourself a little bit. And I'm happy to say I've never run into this one myself. However, how about mice and birds, nests of other kinds of critters and so on?
Right.
And these are real things that you do run into. So the next couple of slides I want to talk about and invite comments on from anybody here is when you start out at the beginning of the season, getting just like a flight starts long before you turn the engine on with pre-flight planning, the beginning of the season starts off before you actually get to the hangar. The first thing you do is let's start with the paperwork. Is anything missing? Do I have everything I'm supposed to have? We all know that there's documents supposed to be in the airplane. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but do I have all the paperwork? Check the aircraft logbook, see if there's anything in there. Is the registration current? Once upon a time, if you bought an airplane and you registered it, it was registered for life. You never had to worry about it again. Today, aircraft registrations are valid for, I believe it's 3 years. And every 3 years, you have to renew the subscription or the registration. Now, in my case, usually you'll get a notice that says it's time to renew, but it may not be perfect in that the mail might fail, there might be a problem, whatever it might be. And so I want to make sure the registration is current. Is my insurance up to date? I want to make sure of that. Is the annual current? Particularly with this year, we normally start flying in April again. This year it was May or June. Did the annual expire during that time? How about new ADs? Just because the airplane isn't flying for a few months, there might still be ADs coming out. Cessna, what is it, 206s have a new AD pending. Piper aircraft with the wing spars, they're still talking about that, but those can come out. How about your altimeter static, the ELT battery, the transponders? Are those all up to date? Did you equip for ADSB before putting the airplane away for the year? Because that's now a requirement depending on where you fly. And your GPS database may have expired. So you want to make sure all of that is current. I'm suggesting that before you go out to the hangar and do your normal process, start with a initial walk around and just look the airplane over. I've got a friend, he's actually a presenter for AOPA, lives out on the West Coast, and he has a saying, you can always tell if I pre-flighted your airplane because there's fingerprints all over everything. He likes to touch everything, move everything, shake everything, make sure it's well attached and so on. But this first check of the season, we're going to really be looking the airplane over. You would be amazed where birds can get in, where mice can get into. And I'm not going to tell the story right now, but I have a story to tell about mice infesting airplanes. That was another reason that helped me get my Cessna 175 for an attractive price. It was a lot of work getting that out of there.
So Norm, there's been a couple of questions about what is an aircraft operator, and so I've looked up the regulation. It says aircraft operator means a person who uses, causes to be used, or aircraft operator authorizes to be used in aircraft. That's essentially described purpose of air navigation, including the piloting of an aircraft. So basically, if you're the pilot of an aircraft, you're considered the operator. You don't have to have you don't have legal control of it, such as owner, lessee, or otherwise. So that's what the regulation says.
Good point. Thank you. Okay, so back to this initial walk around, touching and feeling and pulling on everything. I would really not want to find out that I have a hornet's nest in the airplane when I'm airborne. So I want to look for those real carefully. Uh, you want to make sure the pedostatic and the fuel vents don't have any nests in them. I have heard more stories of airplanes that have been brought down by a wasp nest or a mud dauber or something in a fuel line, or even an event that has prevented the airplane from getting enough gas to the engine. The tires, if you haven't operated the aircraft in 6 months, they might be weather checked, particularly if the airplane's tied down rather than in a hangar. The UV rays are going to affect it. Check the brakes, both for fluid leaks and excessive rust on the rotors. A lot of us put special covers on the airplanes in the winter, something we don't use on a regular basis, but we want to really seal things up. Also, some airplanes will have a winter cover, for example, on the oil cooler, so that the airplane doesn't cool the oil as much, keep it up at operating temperatures. Want to make sure all of those are removed. If the airplane's tied down outside, in addition to the inside gust lock, there might be something securing the rudder in the elevator. Want to make sure those are out. And then start looking at some of your systems, the battery, the fuel tanks. Get up on top of the wing, pull some gas out, make sure it looks right, smells right, and so on. When it comes to sumping, don't just do the half cup and look at it. Sump it again, and do it again. Make sure you draw a good supply of gas out to make sure if there's any moisture condensed in there, you get it out.
Hey, Norm, somebody has
Yeah.
actually commented on this point, and this to address the shelf life of fuel. And so, your regular 100 low lead lasts for a fairly long amount of time, but something like if you're using MoGas in a Rotax engine or something, you have a much shorter span where the fuel stays good. So I think that was a good point to make.
Absolutely. Anything, the MoGas is not as stable. There are, of course, fuel stabilizers available, which make things better. I will say when I lay up my airplane for the winter, I usually fly at least every 90 days. There's only once in my life that I fell out of currency. So the longest my airplane tends to sit is up to 90 days and usually less than that. So I don't use any preservatives, but if you're using auto gas, you certainly want to be careful with that.
Especially if it has ethanol in it. That's
ethanol in an airplane is just a bad idea if you can possibly avoid it. My airplane does have an STC for auto gas. I'll be honest, I've never flown on it yet. The previous owner did. If I have to, it's nice to know that I can legally do it, but I don't really want to try and find out if I don't have to.
All right.
I want to touch on oil for just a minute. A lot of people will say, well, I'll go out to the airport and I'll just run the engine for a few minutes to keep it lubricated up and so on. It's really not a suggested procedure. Running the engine on the ground never gets the engine up to full operating temperature. Running it long enough and hard enough to get the engine up to the temperature that'll boil water out of the oil is going to overheat the engine if it's an air-cooled engine. So really suggest that you don't try and do that on the ground, but rather wait until you can get the airplane up in the air. If you have to, worst case scenario, it's a good idea to do an oil change before you put the airplane away so you don't have contaminants in the oil. If you have to, you might do an oil change in the spring. My engine usually runs enough that I don't have to worry about that. But if you find a lot of moisture in there, you're going to want to check the engine out very closely before you fly. Now we get on to basically what becomes our standard pre-flight, but we're going to start with the printed walk-around, the walk-around that is in the regular pilot operating handbook. Going back around the airplane again, the important thing when you're doing this throughout the whole process, a lot of times owners, we've had our airplane for a while, we know the airplane pretty well, and so we kind of do it by habit. You want to make sure that you treat that airplane like you've never seen it before. You touch and feel and push on everything to make sure that you are checking it thoroughly, not just a casual pass over. Then continue on to the interior check. And again, pause on every item, no matter how long you've done it, no matter how long you've owned the airplane, how often you've done it. You want to be sure that you don't become automatic about it. And Keith, I know you sort of made fun of me on this one the other day, but use all of your senses. You're going to touch everything. You're going to pull on it. You're going to look at it. You're going to examine it from different angles. Every time you flip a switch, when those gyros start up, listen. You may start to hear some grinding noises in some of the bearings or something else that wasn't there the last time you flew the airplane. Whatever it is, listen for those strange sounds. And
Well, you know what that means? It's time for a G5, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, there we get into budgeting again, the advantages of renting versus owning.
There you go.
It's an investment.
All right.
And lastly, smell. We've all flown our airplanes, and most of them have different odors that we've become used to. Oftentimes, an airplane has a bit of a musty smell. But if you have a rodent problem in the airplane, believe me, you'll know about it as soon as you open the door. That's less common. But when you flip a switch, your smell is going to tell you if maybe there's a little electrical arcing. If you smell that acrid smell of an electrical arc, it's time to step back, turn that switch back off, and take a look around. Be more careful before you go forward. And probably the last thing, and I had personal experience with this on the airplane I have right now, because the airplane did sit for some period of time, I had an intermittent problem on the radio. And we chased around on it any number of things. We found, of course, it was more than one problem. But the last problem that we traced down was if I keyed the microphone, half of the time people could hear me and half of the time they didn't. But if I pushed down on the microphone plug, then they could hear me again. But I didn't really want to fly the airplane with my finger on the microphone plug all the time. And so what we found out is there was simply a bit of corrosion on the plug for where the microphone plugged in. Little emery cloth and 30 seconds of buffing out, and suddenly I've got a great connection. No more problem there. The point is, after a long layup, expect some surprises because you're bound to find some. Usually they're fairly small, they're easy to deal with, but you want to make sure you catch them on the ground.
Hey, Norm, what would you say during storage? Would you go to the plane and turn on the master switch to run fans and gyros, or is that just like a battery waste?
Well, the first thing about storing an airplane, if it's at all possible, almost anytime you're in a hangar, if it has electricity, even if you're out on a ramp, often electric is available. I'm a big believer in keeping an airplane attached to a battery tender at all times when it's parked.
Oh, I agree. Having had a boat and my son's car who does the same thing, keep it charged.
Yeah, if you have an airplane that has an electric clock in it, it's a tiny amount of energy that's being pulled off of the battery when the master's off, but that tiny amount of energy over 90 days in cold weather brings the battery down. And most batteries will stay in really good shape and last for a long, long time if you keep them fully charged. If, on the other hand, you let the battery get drawn down and then try and charge it back up and then let it get drawn down again, it shortens the service life of the battery. So keeping the aircraft attached to a battery charger when you're not using it, great idea. Turning on the gyros probably won't hurt anything. It's not like running the engine and not getting it up to operating temperature. But there is another step to that. Pablo's got his assistant.
This is one of the others. This is the dog. Sorry.
All right, Norm, let's roll to the last slide here and we'll start the
okay.
question and answer session.
Let me just touch on one last thing. When you start those gyros, if you're going to do that, preheat the cabin because it's not good for those instruments to start operating when they're 20 below zero. So you want to make sure you get the cabin heated up to a reasonable temperature above freezing, just like you want to make sure that you preheat the engine before you start it as well. Okay, I will go on to the next slide, which is telling us about next week. Keith, why don't you tell them about next week?
So next week, we're really excited to have AOPA President Mark Baker. He's an esteemed pilot, flown a whole lot, and we're going to talk to him about keeping current. And so we'll talk about a little bit about the general state of the of general aviation, and about our flying and how Mark himself keeps current. So we're really looking forward to that.
The interesting thing about him will be one of the things is how many airplanes does he know how to fly, and so how does he keep current for not each one, but obviously that's I think it'll be a pretty nice little topic for us.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
Boy, do we have questions.
I'm going to kick one thing before we go to the questions, which is we mentioned that there's a handout available. Don't get rusty. First flight of the season. If you download that, you'll have my contact information if you want to reach out to me. It's there on the screen right now. But again, that contact information, as well as the links to the materials we talked about, is available on that Don't Get Rusty. So with that, let's look on to some questions.
Yeah, so let me start by saying that a certain John Collins has said, "Great job, Norm."
Thank you, John.
Who's that
guy? Okay, so we're getting some questions here. I've seen two, probably a third and a fourth come through just in the last minute or so about when will the replay be available.
I'll take that. It's a process, okay? We've got to get, first of all, it has to finish processing and go to webinar, and that takes several hours. And our internal process is to get it uploaded to AOPA Live YouTube channel, and it should be sometime late tomorrow by the time everything works out, but that it will be available. And if anybody wasn't here, as far as the wings credit, that happens automatically. It will happen sometime next week. If you're here and you signed in under your webinar that you use for the FAA safety program, you don't have to do anything to get credit for that. So, Pablo, next.
Here we go. Okay. What about the idea of having your annual after the winter is over, before you fly again?
That's certainly, there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, I often set up to get my annual done during the winter. And here's my thought behind it. I like to get it later on in the winter. I don't fly a lot in the winter. If the airplane is being annualed in July or August or September, it's beautiful flying weather. And if it turns out that there's some odd little part that's necessary and we have to spend a week searching for that part, and then a few more days waiting for it to come in, and then they've got to work it back into the schedule to get it into the airplane. I did have an airplane down for annual for 3 weeks in the middle of the summer, and I wasn't very happy about that. So personally, I like to try, right now I have a June annual because I bought the airplane in June. And I like to take my airplane in this case, on the 29th of the month, so that by the time they finish the annual and do the paperwork on it, it'll be July. And then next year, I'll go 13 months again if I can, and move that annual completely legally to do it, move that annual so it's at a time when I don't fly as much. And certainly setting it up for an April annual or something like that, depending on when your flying season starts. Great idea. It's a whole nother story in Western New York compared to Southern California or Texas or someplace like that, because we have a flying season that's between 6 and 8 months of comfortable flying, whereas down in Southern California, the flying season runs year round.
Cool.
Good point.
All right. Looking to buy soon. Are there any good apps that track the maintenance and make certain I stay in compliance?
I know
I'm sure there are. And when you get into a commercial operation, for example, what AOPA has for our fleet of aircraft, very definitely so. I'm not sure personally that it would be cost effective for a private owner to do that. I do subscribe to a service, costs about $100 a year. I think it's a little less, that guarantees that I have a full list of all the ADs that are applicable to my aircraft, and makes sure that I know of any new ones that come out. and it tracks the compliance so that once they're done, I don't have to go back, don't have to have the mechanic go back and track exactly where those ADs are. That'll happen once when the aircraft transfers ownership, and then, or I should say, transfers mechanics. Once the aircraft is being cared for, let me track back a little bit. I bought the airplane out of town, and so I ended up having a pre-buy inspection. And by the way, if you're thinking about buying an airplane, please don't think about buying the airplane without having a full pre-buy inspection done. And I also strongly advise getting a title search done, because that'll find out if there's any liens against the airplane or anything of that nature. And you'd be amazed at how often that happens. I used an independent mechanic that was recommended to me by a friend and was also agreeable to the seller, but he's not my regular mechanic. The airplane is now going in to be inspected by the guys I use all the time. Once they've gone through the airplane, and they will be very thorough, once they've gone through the airplane one time, they have an idea of what the airplane is. There's stuff they don't have to go back and wonder about. They'll have done their extra effort the first time around. And they tend to find little things that have been let go in the past, and that's just fine by me.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Guys, I just found an article that AOPA wrote. It's a little low. It's 2014, but it's about maintenance tracking reference. I'm going to put that into the main chat.
I do know there is an app, and that's all I'm going to say. Maybe look at it and see if this works for you. I'm not going to review it. I'm not going to say anything about it. It's called CoFlight, CoFlyt. That's all I'm going to say. Take a look. It might help.
I'm going to come back to one thing, and this is something I spent a fair amount of time reviewing the logbooks of the aircraft, and going back to 1958, that takes some time. But I put together a status sheet, and again, it just reminds me of when everything is due. There's certain things we know we've got to do. Depending on the ELT, the battery is good for 5 or 10 years. I'm not going to remember when it's due, but it's written down on the sheet that I see. The annual, of course, is every year. Pedostatic is, I think, every 2 years. All of that, I have it marked down so that I also have when my medical is due on the same sheet, just to remind me. I have pretty much everything except my last currency flight of 3 takeoffs and landings that I'd look at in my logbook.
Okay, we're at 1:03 here, and so the webinar is officially over, but we're going to stay here and answer questions for as long as there are questions that we can answer. And we will, I notice a lot of these questions are very technical AMP type of questions, and I will note that none of us are AMPs on this particular webinar, but we have had them in the past, and we will identify an AMP. I think there seems to be a lot of demand for this sort of information, and so we will have in one of our future shows an ability to answer and ask these more technically oriented questions.
Sounds great.
All right, Pablo.
All right, we have a lot of questions, so let's keep them short and concise here. Does 14 CFR Part 43 apply only to me as a pilot working on my own airplane, or can another pilot do the work on my airplane independently, like changing a tire?
I'll take that. Owner operator. You have to be owning it or operating it. Otherwise, you can't do it.
Any recommendations on battery tenders?
I have seen Tractor Supply, Auto Supply battery tenders used. I do not recommend them. When we get into aircraft batteries, they generally are specialty built. A lot of people are starting to convert over to glass mat batteries instead of the traditional lead acid. But in the case of all of these batteries, they're designed to be charged in a certain way. Most of them, there's one brand that specifically states that you void the warranty using a automotive type charger because it's designed to be charged at a higher voltage. And so there is a special battery charger designed for that. Surprise of surprises, the specialty battery chargers, you can go into an auto parts store and buy a battery charger for 20 bucks. If you go get that official battery tender for brand name battery, it's almost 10 times that. But it will prolong the life of your battery. It's designed to regularly desulfate the battery so that all the plates inside stay clean, and the battery is going to give you a much longer service life.
All right. Do you know if an owner can install PMA LEDs? I read them as they're written.
LED maybe?
Well, I'm thinking that what they're applying to is, for example, replacing our traditional landing light with a LED landing light that is PMA'd. And the answer to that, to the best of my knowledge, I am not an A&P and I never played one on TV. But to the best of my knowledge, yes, you can. I hope so, because I did in my last airplane.
Oh, you shouldn't have said that. Okay, moving
No, I
on.
didn't say anything. Yeah.
Moving on. All right. How would I identify water in the engine oil? Sorry if I missed that part.
Pulling
Just
out the
taste,
dipstick.
right? No, don't taste your oil. No.
It's definitely diluted.
Yeah.
Keith, you can do whatever you want on your airplane. When you pull the dipstick out, you'll sometimes find moisture on the dipstick. More importantly, or more likely, if you run the engine, even if it's for a short period of time, if there's moisture, your oil is going to start to take on a milky looking consistency instead of that gold look. If it's black, it's probably due for an oil change no matter what. But good clean oil is kind of golden in color. If the engine's been run just even for a few moments, if you've got that milky look to it, it's mixing water into the oil, and you want to make sure you change that right away.
Okay. Question, is it bad to start the engine just to taxi to a different part of the field?
Personally, I prefer not to if it's a cold engine. Let me rephrase that. If I've just completed a flight, I will stop at the fuel pump, I'll refuel the airplane, and then I'll taxi back to the hangar. However, if the airplane's been sitting in the hangar and the engine is cold, and I just want to taxi it over to the mechanics, for example, to have some service done on it, in that case, I don't want to start the engine, because when the engine is cold, oil is drained down away from a lot of the surfaces. And so the most wear you will have on an engine is generally on startup. To start it up to taxi for 3 to 5 minutes, then shut it down, and then do the same thing to taxi back, that's doing 2 startups when you don't really have to. My preference is, that's why I have the tug in the hangar.
Okay, thank you. All right, like I said, I'm gonna keep going through this pretty quick. When you rent an airplane, you have an incident due to mechanical failure from not maintaining well, what would be the repercussion in terms of insurance?
Ooh, I've never played an insurance agent either.
Well,
I
let's
would
not
say,
start now.
That's right.
I would simply say, as an owner of an aircraft, the insurance company is saying, what do we think of this aircraft? How insurable do we think the aircraft is? And what do we think of the owner in terms of their likelihood? There's a reason why if you stick with one company and you have several years of zero claims, oftentimes your premiums will actually go down because they develop a trust in you, they start to know you, and they see that you are a responsible individual. If, on the other hand, you are slack on the maintenance, or you're cited for any maintenance issues, then the insurance company is likely to look at you and say, this person is probably not as good a risk, and you're probably going to see your rates go up.
And I believe, Pablo, that was a renting question. They're asking about if you're renting an airplane and that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, and just to go along that renting side of things, then remember that as a renter, even though you're not the owner operator, as the pilot in command, you are responsible that the maintenance has been done. So if you have any suspicion that something's sketchy, that's on you. And it's another thing if you've done your due diligence, the inspections are all done, but it's if the inspections, if it's been sketchy and they can somehow prove that you knew about it or it was common knowledge, remember the insurance company is going to be potentially looking for a way to not have to pay a claim. And if you're in violation of regulations, which in that case you would be if maintenance wasn't done properly, then they're not going to cover you. And of course, the majority part of that, I would imagine, would go to the people that operate it. Again, I'm not an insurance agent or anything like that, but
Sounds like another show
idea.
idea.
Yeah, another show idea for sure.
To
Okay. All
follow
right.
up on that, Chris, you know, in the Rusty Pilot seminars, we talk about the pilot's responsibility to verify the paperwork. If you're renting an airplane and you're asked to see the logbook to verify that, yes, it's in annual and so on, if they say, no, we don't show logbooks to people, my advice is 180 degrees, walk out the door and don't go
Yep.
back.
Yep.
Okay.
You need to know that.
I really love this one, so pay attention. Hello. Great seminar.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you for all the great info.
All right. Well,
Can I legally paint some areas of the aircraft that require some attention?
You know, that's a great question, and I got a great answer for you. Yes.
Oh.
If you go back and you look at this, if we could go back and look at the slide that we had on permitted preventive maintenance, we don't need to go back to it, but you'll see it if you download those resources we talked about. You'll find that repairing protective surfaces, protective coatings, is allowed. So touching up paint, for example, and patching fabric, so long as it doesn't involve rib stitching, these are all considered preventive maintenance. And yes, you can certainly do that.
well, as I recall, it said decorative coatings, right? So I would think that it would have to be done in good taste.
And that's so
Leaves us
Norm,
out, guys.
almost like you knew. So this is totally with your answer. Someone asked, what is rib stitching?
Rib stitching is a method used to attach fabric to primarily the wings, possibly also other surfaces, well, certainly control surfaces on a fabric covered airplane. It's something that I have done a few times just as a training exercise. I certainly wouldn't trust myself to do it without some additional instruction. It's not your very simple stick a needle through it and pull it back out the other side. There's special knots used and so on. But it's one of the ways that's used to secure fabric to the wing structure to make sure it doesn't separate.
Okay.
All right. Let's see. That was such a good one. Okay. What is the average cost of an annual or a pre-buy inspection? Which I'm sure autocorrect made that. It should be a pre-buy inspection.
Well, it depends on the airplane. Mine wasn't quite so pretty when I first got to
That's right.
Does that cost more or less?
you know, that's considering the mouse smell, I think more.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult question to answer because a lot of it has to do with your locale. If you are in the Los Angeles area, if you're in the New York City area, I've heard rates for standard pre-buys, usually, or excuse me, annuals. The annual inspection is usually a flat rate plus anything they find. So I generally, in my neck of the woods, I generally budget $1,000 for an annual, and I hope they don't find too much. There's a flat rate just a little bit below that. But if you are in a community where the hangar rent, for example, is tremendously expensive compared to what the hangar rent is that my mechanics are paying, you can expect to pay well over that. I've heard of flat rate annuals twice what I pay easily. The other thing that is a consideration is the aircraft. I specifically want an aircraft with a fixed gear and a fixed prop because I don't want to pay the extra costs. If you have a retractable gear and an adjustable prop, that's more to inspect, and it probably will close to double the cost of your inspection, your annual inspection, even if nothing is wrong. So you have to keep those matters into account. What I would suggest is if you're thinking of buying an aircraft, call around to one or two of your local aircraft mechanical services and simply say, I'm looking at an aircraft. I know that this can change depending on condition, but could you tell me, what's your standard rate for an annual? Just to touch on the pre-buy inspection, pre-buy inspections usually start out a little bit less than an annual, but a pre-buy covers a lot of the same ground that an annual does, but it also looks at other things. So in the case of my airplane, it was actually out of annual when I purchased it, But if the airplane is anywhere within about 5 or 6, even 3 months of being due for an annual, I would have I want to do the pre-buy inspection to make sure it's worth investing some money in the airplane, and then I want the mechanic to roll it right into a fresh annual. I want to start out with 12 months. There's no sense paying for a pre-buy, which is doing half of what an annual is or more, and then having to do an annual again 4 months later.
Okay, Pablo, while you look for the next question, somebody did point out the difference between doing a work on an aircraft and signing it off. I mean, even a standard category aircraft, if you're working under the supervision of an A&P, anybody can do the work, but it's going to take the A&P or an IA, depending on the situation, to sign it off. And that's more or less the same for experimental. I mean, so you can do the work, but in the end, it's going to have to be an A&P signed it off. So there's a difference there. And it's getting a little bit deeper than we were going to get into on this webinar, but that question was pointed out.
All
Here's
right,
a later question. Oh, sorry. I had a later question for Norm I saw in there. Where did you get the hitch for your airplane on the tractor? I stole it.
I've got a buddy that welds. The tow bar, I've got a regular tow bar for the airplane that, they've got the tweezers that lock onto the nose wheel and then a handle that pulls out. And we simply took out the handle that pulls out, inserted a rod in there, and then put a hole in the far end of it and a drop pin that goes into a welded on hitch on the tractor. Actually, the tractor had that hitch for pulling a yard cart or something like that in the back, but we welded another one onto the front, which is nothing more than a glorified washer. But the nice thing is that I can sit and look forward at the airplane while I'm trying to back it up. And so that makes it much easier.
All right, so someone had a question I thought I'd ask just because, well, we want to be helpful as well. Owner of a 1946 Air Coupe, which has been sitting for 20 years in mother's pool house. I'm back to restoring, need cowling. Any suggestions, any groups, and where this person could find one, such as wrecked or graveyards or something? I put that in the, I also put it in the, in the chat. So if anyone would like to help, and this is Robert, please chime in the chat or in other ways.
Number one, there's got to be a type club for an air coupe, and type clubs are tremendous resources in case like that. There is also a strong likelihood that there is a Facebook group for that type of aircraft, and I actually found something hard to find for my airplane through a Facebook group, and I found something else that I posted on the Facebook group, and I've had 2 other people say, yay, that's great. I went ahead and ordered it. If you go to Controller, no, Barnstormers, I think it is, might be Controller, there's an opportunity to plug in a part number. If you're restoring an aircraft, you certainly don't want to do it without a full illustrated parts catalog. Look up the part number, plug it in there, and the chances are you'll find an airplane graveyard someplace that has that part advertised. I'm not going to tell you what the price is going to be, but that's a great place to look for it, and a couple of good places to advertise that you're looking.
Cool, thank you. All right, so we've been talking a lot about obviously mechanics and A&P, all that kind of stuff. So someone just said, can you provide advice on how to find a good mechanic?
Ask around.
That's a big one.
Ask around for other people's experience, absolutely. Go talk to the guy. If he doesn't have time to talk to you, go find somebody else. Find somebody that you like, that you think is trustworthy. Something that I do is before anything else, I walk into the shop and I just look around. The mechanics that I have used, you walk in there, the floor is clean. If oil spills, it gets wiped up. There's a place for everything. Everything goes back into its place. I've also walked into shops where the floor is completely covered in oil spills, where there's stuff falling off of shelves, where there's aircraft cowling stacked on top of other things or under other things. And that makes me nervous how my airplane parts are going to be handled. I'm not saying these guys don't know what they're doing, but It really gives me a pause for consideration. I like the neat, organized approach. And I like the guy that says, yeah, I've got some time to talk, or I'm really busy right now, but would you come back at about 3 o'clock and I can talk with you then? That's an equally valid answer.
Cool. All right, that's a couple more. We're getting along in the 12:21 here, Central. I'm going to combine a couple of these because I've actually made inadvertently a couple of these in here, but asking about either gas stabilizers, cam guard, stuff like that. So is all that stuff helpful and approved?
Maybe.
Right answer.
You don't want to throw a bunch of stuff into your airplane that's not certified, because if something happens, then as was, I think it was Chris brought up, if the insurance company, if the airplane comes out of the sky and the engine stopped running and they find you've got some unapproved fuel treatment in there, the insurance company might say, there's some liability here that you put an unapproved material in there. There are some oil additives that are approved for aviation engines that are designed, for example, for layup periods. And something I am concerned with is moisture, crankshafts, and so on. If it's an approved one, there is one that I tend to be a believer in, and I do use in my engines because they don't run for a period of time, and it's intended to keep the oil on the lubricated surfaces, cylinder walls, and camshafts especially. Try and keep
All right,
them
Papa,
lubricated.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay. Oh my goodness.
Choose wisely.
Choose wisely. Okay. All right. This is a good ender here. Any safety concerns when leaving the airplane for a long period of time unattended on a battery charger?
Another good argument for going with a high quality dedicated battery tender for your type of battery. You don't want to use a battery tender that's designed for glass mat batteries on a lead acid battery and vice versa. I do tend to have a little bit more confidence in a certified product than in a $14 discount battery charger sold by the local discounter. So anytime I leave anything on, I'm a little bit nervous, but I have to have some faith in some places.
All right. With that, we are going to bid you adieu. Thanks once again for joining this week for Don't Get Rusty. And we will be back next Thursday, 12 noon Eastern, with Mark Baker. And so thanks for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, have a good
Great
one,
to be
guys.
here.